Professor Camilla Naidu, Executive Dean for the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Suzy Graham, the inductee, Professor Maxi Skuman, Respondent Emeritus Professor and former Deputy Dean, Postgraduate Studies and Ethics, Humanities, HOD of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, and Adjunct Professor in the School for Public Policy at George Mason University in the United States, MEC and ELG, senior leaders of the university, members of Senate and other academics, distinguished guests, students, all who have joined us online. Sanibonani, goeienaand, good evening, Tobela. It is indeed a great honor and a special privilege for me to welcome you to the Professorial Inaugural Lecture of Professor Suzy Graham. As I do so, I wish to express a warm welcome to her loved ones, her family, special guests, and colleagues. This is indeed a proud and joyful, yet a landmark moment for all of you, for Professor Suzy Graham, for us here at UJ, and for higher education in South Africa and beyond. And I'm going to pause here. Now, I don't normally go off script, but I thought I'll make an exception for Professor Graham this evening. I also asked her permission if I could speak about both her and her sister. So many of you know Professor Graham is one of twins. And when it is a twin special moment, then you allow the twin to shine. Isn't that so, Suzy? Isn't that so, Vicky? But I wanted to more speak about their character, and that is why I asked her for permission to speak about them as a collective. Now, being one of twins myself, I am allowed to then speak about twins as a collective. I think that you would be hard-pressed to convince me that there isn't somebody online or somebody in this room who isn't going to agree with what I'm going to say about Suzy and Vicky and their character. They are possibly of the most outstanding human beings that I have ever met. They are filled with joy. They are always happy. They are respectful. They are kind. They are diligent. And they are hardworking. And I actually said to Suzy that I cannot wait to meet their mother, Mrs. Graham, because I want to meet the mom I want to meet the person, I should say, who raised such outstanding young women. Mrs. Graham, I want to speak to you. I honestly want to say to you that it is an honor and it is a joy and a pleasure to have your daughters at UJ. You have done a fantastic job of raising these two women, and they are and exemplify, I am sure, everything that you have taught them to be. And I want to assure you that they fly the Graham flag very high, and they make you proud every single day. And I just thought that I would take an opportunity to just share how special they are to us. And so people know me as not normally going off script, but I thought for this occasion tonight, I just wanted to share with you how much we treasure them and value them. And thank you for lending them to us for 60 hours a week, because it is definitely not 40 hours a week. But thank you so much. Can we give Mrs. Graham a round of applause? Back to the script. This is particularly noteworthy as we celebrate 20 years of UJ this year. Since the merger in 2005, we have come to exemplify how excellence and access are not mutually exclusive in higher education. In the spirit of innovation and social responsibility, UJ has pushed boundaries and prioritized research, technological advancement, and community engagement. It is against this backdrop that we welcome you, Professor Suzy Graham, into the Professoriate, a community of scholars dedicated to UJ's ethos of academic excellence while making a tangible impact on society. The inauguration of professors is a public ceremony in which newly appointed professors are inducted into office by the Vice-Chancellor and deliver their inaugural addresses. The ceremony has its roots in medieval university and serves multiple purposes. First, it is an expression of welcome and an entry for new professors joining the circle of colleagues who are already professors. Secondly, it provides a platform for professors to display their expertise in the discipline and to showcase their research. In the colonial tradition subscribed to by many universities, assuming the role of professor refers to the gown and the cap. Once we have listened to the inaugural address, the gown denoting the professorship will formally be assumed. Today we gather to witness Professor Suzy Graham's entry into the illustrious community of scholars at our university. It celebrates her contributions to the discipline and ultimately her impact on society. Professors provide a university with its identity, character, academic legitimacy, and integrity. The inaugural lecture is a rite of passage following the confirmation of the appointment of a person as a professor. The lecture is when the expertise of the inductee is showcased beyond the corridors of the university and reverberates within society. It stands out as a moment of pride for the incumbent, the family, fellow scholars, the university, and ultimately society. In the past, several philosophers and scholars have defined universities using very narrow conceptualizations. For example, the search for truth, for universal knowledge, and even as instruments serving the purpose of the economy or being utilitarian in nature. Through our work and research at UJ, I hope that we can break out of these narrow conceptualizations and reflect on the university as contributing to the public good, working towards societal impact. What then is the role of the intellectual? Edward Said, in one of his articles, defines the role of the intellectual as, and I quote, one who commands a vast knowledge of a specific discipline, one who is rigorous in the analysis of literature, who views being an intellectual as a vocation, and who functions as a kind of public memory to recall what is forgotten or ignored, to make the connections that are otherwise hidden, and to provide alternatives for mistaken policies. End of quote. It remains then for us as a university with a Pan-African vision to derive our mandate as intellectuals and as professors. And importantly, how do we embrace the role of a professor as a disruptor while continuing to be flagship carriers of our discipline? This evening, we will listen to Professor Suzy Graham as one further step in the journey of being a professor. This is a journey which does not conclude once this lecture has been given. This inaugural lecture creates an opportunity for a self-reflective pause in the journey of being a professor. Let me now invite the Executive Dean, Professor Camilla Naidu, to introduce Professor Suzy Graham. I thank you, Rialeboga, Niabonga, baie dankie.
Vice-Chancellor Functionary Prof. Siam Khan, Discussant Prof. Maxi Skuman, Inductee Prof. Suzy Graham, MEC members present here today, ELG members, Vice Deans, heads, guests, members of Suzy Graham's family, in particular Mrs. Graham. Welcome to Prof. Suzy Graham's inaugural lecture. Sanibonani, Dumelang, Goeiemorgen. My role is to offer a short biography of Prof. Suzy Graham. Prof. Suzanne Elizabeth Graham, also known simply as Prof. Suzy, is a distinguished academic based at the University of Johannesburg, where she currently holds the position of Senior Director, Academic Development and Support, and Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations. Her academic journey began with a BA in journalism, which she attained, of course, cum laude, from the Rand Afrikaans University, followed by an honors degree in politics with journalism, cum laude, and a master's in political studies from the University of Johannesburg. She earned her doctorate, D.Lit. et Fil., in politics in 2013, focusing on South Africa's voting behavior in the United Nations between 1994 and 2008. She became a permanent member of staff at UJ in 2008. Throughout her career, she has held several roles at UJ, progressing from tutor and temporary lecturer to senior leadership positions, including head of department in politics and international relations and vice dean, teaching and learning in the Faculty of Humanities. Over the years, Professor Graham has developed an extensive teaching portfolio, delivering modules on international conflict, introduction to politics, international political economy, foreign policy, and global peace and security. She has also supervised over 60 postgraduate students' honors, masters, and doctoral research. Her expertise lies in foreign policy analysis, good international citizenship, and the role of small states in international organizations. Her scholarly contributions include books, book chapters, journal articles, and reports. Notable works include her monograph, Democratic South Africa's Foreign Policy, Voting Behavior in the United Nations, as well as co-editing editions of the textbook, Government and Politics in South Africa. Professor Graham is actively involved in academic citizenship and leadership. She has been invited to present lectures and talks at various institutions and conferences globally, including guest lectures on terrorism and counterterrorism, discussions on the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and chairing academic panels on contemporary international issues such as the Russia-Ukraine crises. She supervises postdoctoral researchers and numerous PhD and master's students, many of whom have completed significant research under her guidance on topics ranging from the Boko Haram insurgency, Zimbabwe's UN voting behavior, to African mediation and diplomacy. Her committee memberships and leadership roles at UJ and beyond demonstrate her commitment to academic governance and community engagement. She serves on various university committees related to ethics, finance, teaching and learning, and compliance, and is co-president of the Consortium for Regional Integration and Social Cohesion, Social Elevation, also known as Risk Rise. Professor Graham's engagement extends to media and public discourse through interviews, podcasts, and online articles where she has discussed pressing issues such as COVID-19's impact on international relations and Africa's responses to terrorism. She has been recognized with awards including a Teaching Excellence Award from UJ's Faculty of Humanities, attained in 2018, an Advanced HE Fellowship, attained in 2024, and an NRF C2 rating attained this year, 2025. But perhaps her happiest achievement is having shared an almost identical academic journey side by side with none other than her twin sister, Professor Vicky Graham. And this includes receiving the Faculty Prize for Top Student in the Faculty of Arts, as it was known at the time, in 2001, and graduating simultaneously with their doctorates, and we all remember that day, on the 27th of February 2013, and now publishing together. And I think that's so special. Let's give them a warm round of applause. So in summary, Prof. Suzy Graham's work centers on voting behavior at the United Nations, diplomacy, foreign policy analysis, and the role of small states in global governance, contributing significantly to scholarly understanding and policy debates on Africa's place in international affairs. From the Faculty of Humanities side, we are honored to have had you with us from the time you were a student, Prof. Suzy. You are, as Prof. Khan has said, you're an absolute pleasure to work with and an inspiration to staff and students alike. So we look forward to your lecture this evening.
How do I follow all of that now with a lecture? But good evening to the DVC academic Prof. Khan, to the Executive Dean for Humanities, Prof. Naidu, my former boss and my current boss, in that order, and to all of the academic colleagues and friends who have taken the time to join me online and in person today. Thank you so much for being here. I want to begin by thanking my mom, since without her I wouldn't actually be here today. So thank you, Mom, for giving birth to me and Vicky. I appreciate that, for a start, for the constant support, and you're the strongest woman I know, and I take a lot of life lessons from you. And to my brothers, Anthony, Richard, who are sitting here in the audience tonight, and sister-in-law Robin, a medical doctor. She got her doctorate, then I got my doctorate. It was a wonderful, wonderful sequence of events. And to my sister-in-law, Alonka, online, watching, as well as my 5 nieces and nephews, Lucian, Rachel, Mishka, Michael, and Izzy, who all helped me to stay young at heart. And I know that they're watching online, so hello to all of them. But I know that you have tests tomorrow, so keep studying. I also want to thank my dad and Uncle Jim, who have both passed away, who gave me so many supports over the years, as well as Professor Yolanda Sadi for being here, Mrs. Zelda Geldenhuis and the UJ librarians, Mrs. Recho Dube and Barbara Leona, Mrs. Ray Israel, my current secretary, Mrs. Joey Boertis, who this morning brought to the office tiny cupcakes with tiny graduation hats attached to them. So that started my day off wonderfully. To all my postgraduate students, and I see so many of them in this room, whom I learn from every day, thank you so much. To Sean and Nduduzo, my 2 adopted UJ sons, thank you for being here tonight. And you're sitting together, that's so strange, thank you. And thank you also to my ADS family. Some of the colleagues have joined me tonight. Thank you so much for being here. And to those watching online. Thank you also to Prof. Maxi Skuman, who offered her support and for acting as tonight's respondent. She's going to be offering a Zoom recording, so thank you so much to Prof. Maxi. More recently, I also want to thank 5, actually I should say 6 amazing women and role models for me. Prof. Pragna Raghunanan, who's sitting over there, and Prof. Kone Mainkies, for their constant love and support, because it is love and support. Prof. Camilla Naidu and Prof. Khan, Prof. Bettine van Vuren and Prof. Kravitz, very, very wonderful, strong women who continue to support and have faith in me. And then lastly, I'd like to say thank you to my twin sister, Vicky, and to my postgraduate supervisor, Prof. Geldenhuis, because thanks to both of them, I've had many wonderful milestone moments in my academic journey. I'll start with the first one. When my twin sister and I were very young, one of our favorite creative games was to play what we simply called school. She would most often be the teacher, because she's 5 minutes older, and I would most often be the student, and all I cared about was receiving as many green ticks as possible on my homework assignments. And eventually we've ended up with our names on the doors of the same corridor in the same academic departments at UJ. And now we remain in the same university together, effectively with the same job titles, just different divisions. Anyway, I'm so grateful to her. The most important learning curve was on a trip to Luxembourg and Florence, thanks to a grant Vicky won for the Risk-Rise Consortium, and I just tagged along as a travel partner at the time and spent 3 weeks in glorious Italy writing 1 chapter for my PhD. It was over 60 pages, and it was not very good at all. It was after Professor Geldenhuis, in a very diplomatic way, which was usually a lot of red and green pen at the time, because that was still when we used paper printouts for feedback, guided me to focus on something more meaningful and structured. And after that, the model for my PhD just popped into my mind. It was a good reminder and lesson that there are so many steps on the path to what you might consider your own academic greatness, but it's a journey. Prof. Geldenhuis and traditional English breakfasts at Mug and Bean or Cafe Creme in Melville, bowls of Smarties or mini licorice all sorts in the middle of the dining room table as my sister and I sat opposite each other editing each other's theses. These sweets, I profess, are the keys to a good academic start in life. So having said those thanks, and I'm sorry if I left anybody out, I'm just grateful everybody's here. I'm moving on to my lecture for tonight. So, the world welcomed a democratic South Africa. South Africa's relationship with the United Nations is as old as the organization itself, as South Africa was one of the 51 founding members in 1945. Although UN skeptics within the local and global community considered this IGO, or intergovernmental organization for those not in political science, to be outdated and irrelevant, it is nevertheless clear that since the 23rd of June 1994, when democratic South Africa was welcomed back to full participation in the UN, the Republic has demonstrated a keen and continuing interest in the multilateral system of global governance, representing, according to South Africa, the best hope for the challenges that face humanity. Over the years, the South African government's relationship with the UN can be described chronologically as rocky during the apartheid years, celebratory in the early democratic years, and then confusing since 2007, and the onset of the first of 3 of South Africa's Security Council terms. In its current strategic plan, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation outlines South Africa's government as having actively contributed to the maintenance of international peace and security through involvement in mediation and conflict resolution efforts, as well as the deployment of peacekeepers to missions of the UN, as well as serving on the Security Council. And so South Africa continues to be a champion for this global platform. Without a doubt, South Africa has also been keen to serve as an African non-permanent member. It's served 3 times already in the Security Council, 2007-8, 2011-12, and 2019-2020. And over the years, democratic South Africa's popularity has remained constant at the UN. With its latest election to the UN Security Council, 183 positive votes helped South Africa get its seat. That's a significant number of countries voting in favor of the country taking a seat to represent Africa. In 1994, South Africa's first deputy president, Thabo Mbeki, expressed South Africa's UN position at that time as the following: South Africa can be counted on to adhere to the pursuit of important goals of international peace and security and is committed to being a good citizen of the world. This explains why in 2007, when South Africa began its first ever stint as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, interested observers around the world quickly expressed disillusionment over the country's vote against the condemnation of human rights abuses in Myanmar and Zimbabwe, amongst others. South Africa's first opportunity to perform on the Council cast doubt over the consistency of South Africa's foreign policy choices in that forum. More recent critics have referred to South Africa's tactics to voice hollow commitments, but then to raise technical objections when resolutions are proposed. Over time, among these have been arguments that the language is too hostile or divisive, there hasn't been enough discussion, or it's the wrong forum to be raising the issue. We call that ping-pong tactics in international relations. You just keep passing the ball back and forth, and nothing ever gets done. South Africa takes issue with the expert chosen, for example, to observe human rights abuses, or a working group should be initiated and then nothing should proceed until that group has made its decisions, and then nothing happens as a result. Or there is no consensus to the meaning of what a right is, and so on and so on. So South Africa's UN voting behavior is seen as controversial and inconsistent by many because it often avoids decisive votes on critical international issues, reflecting a complex mix of diplomatic, economic, and regional considerations, rather than a straightforward commitment to human rights and international law. The negative attention South Africa received over its initial 2007 votes inspired 2 questions that prompted my initial PhD research, and these questions have continued to drive, over the years, my continued interest in this field. Firstly, was the perception that the Republic had demonstrated ambiguity over the purpose behind the foreign policy an accurate perception to have? And secondly, if these votes were seen as uncharacteristic of South African foreign policy, by implication this would suggest that South Africa had always voted respectably at the UN since 1994. In essence, the question was and is whether or to what extent South Africa's voting behavior at the UN since 1994 was or is consistent with its declared foreign policy. Why walking the talk is actually important for states in international relations. It's true that consistency in a state's foreign policy behavior is normative. However, for foreign policy to be convincing, it must have a rationale. and pattern of implementation that is recognizable. It's not always perceived as respectable at all times by observers. In other words, consistency in foreign policy may have advantages and disadvantages. A state's voting behavior at the UN Security Council is its foreign policy in practice, or at least how a state representative behaves in this platform is expected to be a reflection of that state's position on international issues. After all, it is the function of a diplomat to carry out the mandate of a home government in a foreign theatre. Wherever a state declares specific themes that will guide their foreign policy, it is important to establish the government's commitment to implementing those themes. Naturally, context differs, and states may have to make it up as they go along, but this does not automatically imply that states will suddenly behave in completely unrecognizable ways if a situation changes. It requires a more nuanced interpretation of a multiple, complex environment acting in parallel. Consistency in foreign policy remains nonetheless a struggle for most countries, large and small. Total consistency is in any event an illusion. Foreign policy is about both perception as well as reality, so that appearances and rhetoric play a part, and ambiguity can, in given circumstances, be valuable. All these peculiarities affect consistency. When states align with their stated policies and commitments, or walk the talk, they establish credibility and trust with both allies and adversaries. If a state's action consistently matches diplomatic statements, other countries are more likely to believe in its intentions and reliability. Conversely, if there is a gap between what a state says and does, there are risks identified with that state's behavior. For alliances and partnerships to function effectively, states must demonstrate that their commitments are not just rhetorical. Allies and partners look for tangible evidence that a state will honor its security guarantees, its economic agreements, or diplomatic promises. So failure to walk the talk can erode trust, weaken alliances, and make cooperation more difficult. In a study that I did covering 20 years of South Africa's voting behavior at the UN, I looked at South Africa's voting behavior in 4 different thematic areas. And I was able to conclude that overall, 80% of the time, South Africa was consistent with its declared foreign policies. This was in reviewing over 1,000 votes. That's right, and it took a long time to do it as well. The findings indicated that South Africa's foreign policy at the organization was most consistent regarding UN reform issues, followed by advancing Africa's interests, then disarmament-related issues, and finally, votes related to human rights situations. For a young democracy, this is a relatively decent scorecard. I mean, as students, we all hoped for 80% in anything. So at the time, South Africa had established a reputation for itself as a country that upheld its public statements. And we're reminded of how in the theatre of politics, state actors' perceptions are taken at face value. And therefore, South Africa's reputation, internationally and domestically, is dependent on how it is perceived and how it perceives itself, regionally, on the continent, and internationally. If South Africa ever aims to assume a permanent seat in the Security Council one day, representing Africa, then its history of voting, the congruity or lack thereof in its foreign policy positions, its alignments and controversies will all play a part in its potential to become a standing global player within this institution. Although many international factors are associated with greater consistency in voting behavior, both domestic political factors and international contexts play equally important roles in shaping foreign policy. And so assessing consistency requires multi-layered interpretations. The concept, anyway, is fleeting and difficult to measure. For example, what benchmark can a consistent foreign policy be set against? Although sometimes sudden international changes can cause internal shocks for a country's foreign policy making, predictability, nevertheless, in international relations benefits from consistency in foreign policy. So constancy or consistency has its merits because it can engender stability or at least knowingness about how a state will likely behave in a situation. This can aid regional partners in the UN Security Council Africa 3 especially, or the other elected 10 members, in anticipating how to relate to each other as elected members, and this could save valuable time and effort, especially when the duration of a term on the council for the elected 10 is so limited. 2 years is not enough really to do anything. Long-term consistency, however, could also mean stagnancy and the inability of states to respond differently to emerging or unique circumstances. Immovable positions, however consistent, may result in inaction and/or ineffectiveness. It is possible to distinguish between foreign policies that are truly incoherent and those that are coherent but not adhered to consistently. I define consistency as recurring patterns demonstrating a link between foreign policy declarations and foreign policy actions. At the UN, states are expected to act consistently upon their proposed resolutions, which should hopefully be in line with their declared foreign policy on an issue. But we know that real-world circumstances of the Security Council reveal the inability of the elected 10 members to hold the pen on resolutions in the first place. And secondly, the need for these members to adjust their positions on issues simply to ensure that any resolution that might have some kind of impact in conflict situations will actually be adopted. A framework exists for understanding the potential influence of E10 members in UN decision-making, and this framework includes a number of things, including diplomatic capacities and competencies, favorability of conditions, but I contend that consistency in relation to declared foreign policy positions is another factor that can be considered in how an E10 member's influence can be perceived by observers at the UN. I found it useful to continue to employ a model of voting behavior I developed for my PhD research as an analytical framework in my research. The model I developed led to one of my master's students, Charlene Barnard, completing research on Brex's voting behavior in the UN Security Council in 2011. And two of my PhD students are expanding on my model for their research. Dr. Eve Nyemva, who completed, focused on Zimbabwe's voting behavior in the UN between 2003 and 2016. That was a very interesting thesis to read and supervise. And Connie Herselman, who is currently concentrating on Namibia's foreign policy at the United Nations, looking at the question of gender. And she's going to be submitting in the next month or so. The model I employed allows for a single case study analysis, but can be employed equally as a comparative review of multiple cases. There are really just 3 steps in this model. The first outlines the declared foreign policy of a state, the second examines the actual vote, and the third one interpretations of that vote. Step 3 is important because it speaks to the question of consistency by offering a multi-sided impression of events. I define consistency in this respect. I ask the questions, was the state's UN voting congruent with the state's declared foreign policy on the issue in question? Is the state repeatedly acting on its publicly declared foreign policy? In other words, is the state walking the talk? That is, a vote is considered to be consistent by me if the voting action is directly in line with a foreign policy statement. If the vote is contrary to a declared policy, then I label it as inconsistent. And a partly consistent label will be assigned to those voting actions that reflect a confused or obscure action, but have some kind of official explanation moderately in line with a foreign policy direction or orientation. If I look at the consistency ratings over all the years of my research, and I add them all up, I can see that essentially the Republic has demonstrated in all resolutions pertaining to human rights, particularly, only an 8% inconsistency with its declared human rights foreign policy. 8% is not a lot. It seems particularly insignificant when placed against the 33% partly consistent rating I gave, or the 58% consistent ratings I gave for South Africa under thematic human rights issues. But this 8% is niggling. It's important when considering that it reflects South Africa's negative votes for resolutions that favor human rights promotion in specific countries where human rights are severely lacking or non-existent. What is most apparent is South Africa's fully consistent rating related to its votes on resolutions attempting to reform the UN since 1994, because each vote taken has reflected an earnest desire to restructure that organization and is in direct harmony with South Africa's stated goals on the subject. I've discovered that South Africa really does have a rationale behind its voting behavior. In most respects, there is congruity between South Africa's declared foreign policy and its UN voting. But it has stumbled at times, and sidelining certain principles, especially human rights promotions, stands out. It's a red flag. there's a suggestion that South Africa's refusal to name and shame countries in situations of human rights abuses, preferring instead to abstain or vote against, rarely sponsoring resolutions on these situations in the Human Rights Council, for example, is a testament to South Africa's own history. South Africa came through the transition to democracy via an internally negotiated political settlement. It's plausible to suggest, therefore, that South Africa would not try to impose on another's sovereignty when it had enjoyed the fruits of its own negotiations relatively untouched by the outside world, and therefore would want others to be afforded the same opportunity. Despite this inconsistency that I've expressed before, South Africa has been consistent 4/5 of the time in voting. So this is a remarkable feat. 1/5 inconsistency is relatively minor. But as I said, the nature of the content of this inconsistency is not insignificant, and so it cannot be discarded. The Republic's penchant for using consensus decision-making strategies at the UN, especially in areas related to UN reform, comes up continuously. Apart from pushing for consensus, South Africa, as I said before, uses the ping-pong strategy of procedural manipulation over both human rights and nuclear issues. What is severely disappointing is the Republic's inability to rise above power politics and consider each vote on its merits. This is especially so considering that South Africa's first committee delegates stated that all resolutions were judged on merit and not on their origins. If I look at South Africa's most recent term on the Council, a notable shift, which was very uplifting, I thought, occurred when South Africa, under President Ramaphosa's leadership, voted in favour of a UN General Assembly resolution addressing human rights issues in Myanmar, diverging from its previous abstentions on similar matters. At the time, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation described this vote as a reflection of the new dawn in foreign policy, signalling a return to South Africa's foundational principles of opposing human rights abuses. This represented a significant pivot, as South Africa had traditionally favoured non-interference and deference to regional bodies. South Africa voted in favour of 105 out of 109 resolutions in the Security Council in 2019-2020. More specifically, it voted in favour of the following resolutions dealing with African situations. These positive votes were in line with South Africa's previous votes on similar resolutions in its previous 2 terms. And so it has continued to be consistent in all 3 terms on the Security Council. In terms of consistency, it could be argued that South Africa voted consistently in line with its declared foreign policy statements, more so on situations in Africa for the most part, and partly consistently for the situation in Western Sahara. Although South Africa's position on Western Sahara remains unchanged over the 3 Security Council terms, its choice to abstain in the latest term is different from previous periods and speaks to a more nuanced approach. This reflected an improved focus on language use in resolutions and the motives of pen holders in the Council. South Africa's abstention was a way to indicate reservations without scuppering the chances of the resolution to succeed. In other words, the Republic supported the core purpose of the referendum, the extension of the mandate of the UN mission to hold a referendum in Western Sahara, but wanted the Security Council to note its reservations about the biased nature of the text of the resolution. South Africa exercised its right to abstain and not vote against the resolution. South Africa voted consistently in alignment with its AU, African Union counterparts, apart from decisions on Western Sahara and the resolution on Somalia at that time. But the decision to abstain is a carefully considered act, and it's never made glibly by South Africa. The lessons for South Africa in relation to its Security Council experiences is that geopolitical differences threaten the effectiveness and credibility of the Council to carry out its mandate effectively. An example of this in its most recent term was evident in terms of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Although South Africa was lauded by many for its successful adoption of Resolution 2493 on Women, Peace and Security, the Republic also ran into criticism by local observers for its October 2020 yes vote in favour of a Russian-sponsored draft resolution on the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325. Since Resolution 1325 was adopted in 2000, South Africa has become one of the countries with the highest proportion of female peacekeepers. critics suggested that the draft resolution implied an erosion of women's rights at the UN. But South Africa's DIRCO felt compelled to respond to this criticism, explaining that South Africa joined with the other E10 members, Indonesia and Vietnam, to vote for a resolution that reaffirmed the entire normative framework of the WPS agenda by urging the implementation of all previous resolutions linked to this and adopted by the Council to date. The South Africans furthermore perceived that the objections to the resolution were based on a mistrust of Russia by WPS advocates, rather than any concrete deficiencies in its approach. The resolution ultimately failed to pass, with Germany, another elected member, describing the resolution as a retreat on women's rights. In another area, South Africa's behavior at the UN in 2022 over resolutions pertaining to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, by refusing to vote against Russia, but choosing to remain neutral or abstain, raises questions in terms of international perceptions of the Republic's ability to act independently of Russia's interests. South Africa, though, has, on reflection, acted consistently on its declared foreign policy at the UN Security Council. Its position or approach is that a good multilateral diplomat will pay attention to details and to the process. There's a popular African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. This proverb can explain the dynamics South Africa has encountered on the Security Council. The Republic has attempted to enable closer coordination amongst the A3 during its third term on the Council. That's a significant improvement on the previous 2 terms. South Africa always makes an effort at the UN and uses its resources because South Africa wholeheartedly believes in the value of nations working together for a common destiny. And this is not always perceived by others watching on the news. Coordinated teamwork is a must, and a determination to stay active and alert to the UN Security Council activities, even when not on the Council. It's unlikely that South Africa will serve again anytime soon, as it needs to make room for other Southern African states that aspire to occupy a seat on the Council. But whilst on the Council, South Africa has expressed a voting voice, and it's been prepared to use it. It's established a pattern of behavior in this arena between its declared foreign policy and its actions, and has been somewhat effective in its Security Council role. Assuming that South Africa's foreign policy remains unchanged, and even under the latest government, it continues to hold the same principles, and depending on how soon the Republic will actually return to the Council, whether or not this effectiveness can be harnessed in its A3 and E10 working relationships in future remains to be seen. During its 30 years as a democracy, South Africa has played its part at the UN as one of the most committed delegations present for its votes. Without suggesting that history is destiny, past votes can in certain cases offer a base from which to make cautious judgments of future votes on similar issues at the UN. What is undoubtedly evident from the findings is that South Africa wants to be a big player in Africa and the Global South, and more ambitiously, South Africa wants to be chosen to speak for Africa in the UN. More recently, South Africa's voting consistency on Ukraine can be attributed to several interrelated factors rooted in its historical, political, and strategic context. Firstly, South Africa has maintained a stance of neutrality, often characterized as neutral yet leaning towards Russia, reflecting Cold War-era narratives and a non-alignment approach common among many African states, not just South Africa. This is partly due to long-standing ties with Russia and a reluctance to fully side with Western positions, which are seen as oversimplifying the conflict. Secondly, despite its neutrality, South Africa strongly supports the principle of territorial integrity, a norm critical to many African countries due to their own colonial-era border issues. This explains why South Africa and many African states voted in favor of UN resolutions condemning Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territories, emphasizing the inviolability of borders. Thirdly, the recent elections in South Africa have altered the political landscape within the ruling African National Congress, by it losing its outright majority and needing coalition partners, some of whom are more anti-Russian in their views. This political shift may influence voting behavior in the future and pressure the government to reconsider its stance. In February 2025, DIRCO re-emphasized South Africa's consistent advocacy for a peaceful negotiated resolution to the conflict, emphasizing dialogue, diplomacy, and adherence to international law and the UN Charter. This principle underpins its voting pattern, which does often involve abstentions or support for resolutions calling for peace rather than outright condemnation or sanctions. South Africa's voting pattern aligns with broader African trends, where many countries abstain or vote cautiously on Ukraine-related resolutions. This reflects a mix of historical ties, geopolitical calculations, and concerns about the implications of the conflict for Africa itself. South Africa's consistent voting on Ukraine stems from a complex balance of upholding international norms like territorial integrity, maintaining a non-aligned diplomatic posture influenced by history, navigating internal political shifts, and advocating for peaceful conflict resolution within a rules-based international system. In March this year, DIRCO re-emphasized South Africa's take on current global politics. Despite growing global multipolarity, unilateral actions by powerful nations undermine international law and the UN, eroding trust in global governance, escalating conflicts, and underscoring the urgent need for a just, multipolar, and inclusive order, championed by the Global South amid a complex and shifting geopolitical landscape. And frankly, South Africa has a role to play. It has to play it. I'd like to end with a quote from one of my PhD examiners, Jack Spence, OBE, a South African-born British academic and former professor of diplomacy at the Department of War Studies, King's College London, from a piece he published in 2016, and which still holds in my view. South Africa might be described as a state in perpetual search of a role in which its foreign policy aspirations can be satisfied in coherent policymaking. These include an ambiguous emphasis on human rights, productive economic relations with the West, which is even more true lately, a role as a major contributor to peacekeeping operations, global spokesman for African aspirations on the G20 stage, a leadership role at the UN, earning a permanent seat on the Security Council in due course, a benign hegemonic role in the Southern African region. Therefore, in this enduring search for coherence between aspiration and action, South Africa's foreign policy reveals less a fixed identity than an evolving narrative of purpose. Thank you.
DBC academic Professor Siam Khan, Executive Dean Professor Kamala Naidu, colleagues and students, and family members and friends of Professor Graham. It is truly an honor for me to act as respondent to this inaugural address. My sincere apologies for not being with you in person this evening, but thank you, Professor Graham, for the kind invitation. In a way, it is perhaps fitting for me to do this response. After all, I have, as it were, seen you grow up in our academic community, having been one of your undergraduate lecturers and having followed your career trajectory, often collaborating in various discipline-related activities. Given time constraints, I will confine my response to three main points, apart from, of course, congratulating you, Professor Graham, on an insightful and excellent address. My first point is that Professor Graham is too modest in her treatment of the analytical model that she had developed to do singular and comparative case study reviews of states' voting behavior, not only within the UN system, but also in other international governmental organizations. Her model makes a seminal contribution to scholarship in that it allows for structuring and focusing on large swaths of information, drawing attention to what is important and relevant. In focusing the researcher's attention on specific aspects of voting behavior, including measuring levels of consistency, as well as the processes and dynamics surrounding such behavior, the model then facilitates deep analysis, also through reflection and explanation. I think that we too often neglect to recognize the importance and utility of such analytical tools in building knowledge in our discipline. I speak for several scholars locally and internationally and postgraduate students when I say that we have been using this analytical tool in our own research with solid results. My second point relates to the idea and issue of consistency. In her work, Professor Graham measures the level of consistency in South Africa's voting behavior in the UN, utilizing the core principles of the country's foreign policy as a yardstick. Consistency, or walking the talk, as she puts it, builds credibility and trust, but is also context-related. Her discussion of consistency is nuanced and thoughtful, pointing not only to the difficulties involved in striving for consistency, but also implying that often the exception to a consistent position is politically exceptionalized by adversaries for their own gain. This is particularly evident in the case of allegations against South Africa as being inconsistent in its votes on human rights issues, whereas Professor Graham's research actually shows, though more nuanced than I put it here, that South Africa's human rights voting record is remarkably consistent. I would suggest that a very useful study could be done on this aspect, comparing the voting records of South Africa and the permanent members of the Security Council, or those holding the pen on these resolutions. I also think that in exploring questions of consistency, the case of Palestine should not be neglected. I think back to President Mandela's comment in 1997, and I quote, "Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians," unquote. South Africa's support to and solidarity with Palestine stands as one of the most enduring examples of consistent behavior in our foreign policy. It speaks not only to the core principle in our foreign policy on a commitment to human rights, but also to our commitment to promoting democracy and decolonization, the peaceful resolution of conflict through multilateralism, and respect for international law. My last point relates to the issue of power and the power hierarchy in the international system, with much of this power intertwined with and embedded within the structure of the Security Council. As Professor Graham points out, specifically in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war, South Africa has been accused of voting with friends or succumbing to pressure from friends. But I want to emphasize 2 points here. Implied by Professor Graham's analysis, the first is that in all the UN resolutions around the Russia-Ukraine war, South Africa never voted in line with Russia, or for that matter, China. Rather, it abstained, voting neither with the aggressor nor with the global north driving these resolutions. By this, I do not imply that South Africa never bows to pressure from one or more of the great powers or casts votes seemingly in support of friends. One just has to think back to South Africa's disastrous vote on Resolution 1973 on Libya in 2011, under pressure from the United States. That is not what the Russia-Ukraine voting record shows. I would argue that in cases of serious contention between and among permanent five members, South Africa sticks to abstention as a clear message about its non-alignment. More recently, though, in February this year, we saw South Africa actually voting in the General Assembly in favor of a resolution calling for a swift end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict and recalling the importance of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. The United States abstained on this resolution, so talk about consistency and inconsistency in voting behavior. But this point brings me to Professor Graham's concluding sentence, and I quote, "South Africa's foreign policy reveals less a fixed identity than an evolving narrative of purpose," unquote. South Africa's February vote, its continued interaction with both Ukraine and Russia, its continued support for the Palestinians and independence for Western Sahara, and its continued insistence on the need for UN reform and restructuring of the Security Council are testimony to this evolving narrative of purpose. Professor Graham's work provides deep insight into the enduring principles of South African foreign policy, and the way in which it is implemented on the global south on the global stage through its UN voting record. Thank you, and welcome to the professorial community, Professor Graham.
Ladies and gentlemen, could we applaud Professor Suzy? I want to give the registrar credit because she told me yesterday, I think it was, that when it comes to the robing, she invites family to come and assist her with the robing. And I thought, well, that's a good idea. And I like that sentiment. So I am going to give her credit for that. But also going forward, I am going to invite family because I think it's such a precious moment. And it's lovely if family can be part of the moment of robing. So, Madam Registrar, thank you very much for sharing your idea with me. I appreciate it. Professor Graham, I think the sheer number of people that are in this room, and I'm sure that are joining us online, are a testament to who you are as a person. I want to say that it has been an honor and a privilege to be part of your inaugural this evening. Can we give Professor Graham a round of applause? We have reached the end of the program. So for those who have joined us online, thank you so much for joining us online. And for those who are in the room with us, please join us for refreshments in our, I wanted to say kitchen, but it's not our kitchen, in our lounge next door. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you.